So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Jake Geitner. I'm one of the co-directors for LABash 2021. Additionally, I'd like to thank the University of Hawaii at Manoa's MLA program for sponsoring this talk. At the UHM School of Architecture, students trained in extraordinary Hawaiian landscape with its rich natural and cultural history are equipped with strategies needed to enhance a beautiful, resilient, and healthy built environment. Focused on ecological and social sustainability by design, their MLA program advances contemporary landscape design teaching, theory, and practice in tropical Asia-Pacific coastal regions. To begin today's keynote panel discussion, first we would like to acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayogohó, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayogohó are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayogohó dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayogohó people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Following the panelist presentations, we will reconvene for a discussion moderated by our 2 organizers, Jihany Hassun and Vanessa Dikuyama. Jihany Hassun is a graduate post-professional Master's of Landscape Architecture student at Cornell University and a Latin American Studies Program Fellow at the Mario and Unati Center for International Studies. She is a Canadian citizen of Brazilian Lebanese descent, currently on absentia status, pursuing fieldwork in northeastern Brazil. Jihany's research finds itself at the intersection of conservation, development, and climate change in semi-arid climates. Vanessa Dikuyama is a first-year graduate student at Cornell University Department of Landscape Architecture and served on the LABash 2021 Speakers Committee. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography and Architecture from Middlebury College, along with a strong interest in issues of sustainability and spatial justice, particularly as they impact her home region of Latin America. Vanessa is from and currently lives in Medellin, Colombia. With all that being said, I would now like to hand it off to Vanessa to more formally introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Jake. It is my pleasure to welcome to this virtual stage our first panelist, Dr. Ghazal Jafari. Dr. Ghazal Jafari is a designer of Persian and Azeri descent and territorial scholar in exile. Originally from Durán, her practice focuses on spatial resistance movements, and non-Western spatial discourses. She is the founding director of Millan Rudan Between Initiative, based as a founding director of Open Systems, Landscape Infrastructure Lab, and Quarry.
Hi, I am connected for the permission to be able to reside and work on their land. Today, I'd like to share with you some thoughts and observations in form of a manifesto, a Brown Landscapes manifesto. Brown Landscapes is not a place, but a process that begins with unveiling a series of misrepresentations and interrogating systems of erasure. The history of natural conservation is founded on the history of erasure. In the tradition of colonial landscape representations, Frederick Edwin Church's painting, Heart of the Andes, is a valuable point of reference here, significant but not an exception. Mesmerized by bleached botanical depictions of South America and Mount Chimborazo, specifically by Alexander Humboldt in early 19th century, Church's painting of the Chimborazo volcano is in the current country of Ecuador, instrumentalizes the European style of romantic picturesque, popularized by the Hudson River's School of Painting to depict the illusion of nature as a bountiful wilderness. Later exhibited in Metropolitan Fair in aid of the Sanitary Commission in New York, set up to aid the Union Army during the Civil War. The juxtaposition of the painting and the portrait of American presidents. Perception was then advanced by partitioning of Yosemite and Yellowstone, an establishment of the national park systems as part of what Mark David Spencer calls the dual island systems of nature preserve and Indian reservation. So I would say landscape architecture have had major difficulties to reckon with the erasure of indigenous peoples from their representations and the styles that are still pretty much used, and the professional work as well. Landscape architecture has a serious blind spots, and there are many. Brown people exist in that blind spot. It is important to note that the confused voyage of Christopher Columbus' New World, so-called, in 1492, was funded by the Isabel la Católica, Queen of Spain, when the Spain monarchy announced finally a country free of Muslims and Jews after centuries-long attempt of Latin Christendom to define the Europe as a separate continent, separate from Muslims to the east and Africans to the south. The voyage of Christopher Columbus is wrapped in unnoticed histories of papal bull, Spanish inquisitions, expulsion of non-Christians, and religious missionaries to spread the gospel to the east. It's in this history of white supremacy that Brown is defined as any peoples too were either erased or imprisoned by Western colonialism and imperialism. Westphalian nation state should be under scrutiny as the original technology of Iran by states of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon after. The left image shows partitioning of the wetlands and rivers by imposition of Persia-Ottoman borderlines forced by the British and Russians cutting through the rivers and dismantling river societies. Occupying this borderland were migrating tribes that you can see in these images. Like many other tribes, new ways of seasonal migration as part of complex intelligent land and the steppes between the rivers. Many tribes traveled through what is now borderline, which came only as one of many blockades that demobilized the indigenous peoples and enabled later strategies. This is what that borderline looks now in Kurdistan. Rows of impoverished population labeled as a smuggler livelihood under violent pressures from US sanctions against Iran, killed in masses in the past 5 years more than ever by the militarized Iranian regime that is choking the people but not relinquishing power to the US intimidations. The carceral space then is not limited to prison buildings. It includes border detention camps, deadly migration routes, apartheid zones, and embargoed states. Can landscape then become a vehicle for racial justice that includes refugees, mobilized laborers, caught in international zones, those disposed by all sides of the war as sacrificial animals? Partitioning was preliminary stage of plunder by monopolizing concessions and penetration of Western extraction operations in the lands of brown people without their consent. Images show BP pipeline passing through Bakhteri tribal land where oil was found. These surveys and land acquisitions enabled the arrival of the Americans in the 1950s under the rubric of technical assistance and development as philanthropic way of hiding United States imperial ambitions in the oil-rich region under the appearances of the American democracy. Between bureaucrats, engineers, designers, and planners, they turn the wetland and rivers into metropole at the center and industrial zones in the periphery. American planner Jacques Robertson has keenly observed in 1978, many of us at this conference, it was a conference, obviously, many of us at this conference are what I would have to call cultural and technocratic mercenaries, hired intellectual guns who move about the world from one country to another, giving counsel, doing quick studies, relying on accumulated knowledge, on too weak data and too little experience, and too often only on intuition, overprogrammed, rushed, and beneath it all, dreadfully unsure of ourselves and our various medicines and recipes. Yes, mercenaries, without uniforms or guns, but potentially just as lethal, traveling medicine men of professional practice. We should also ask if philanthropic projects of development and reconstruction too often come after mass destructions, or whether they're another method of fixation of capital surplus in continuous cycles of spatial production founded on ruins and destructions of Storm in 1991. Some of you are very young to remember that, which marks the beginning of the American turn from the long-term ally, the Ba'athi regime of Saddam Hussein, after almost a decade of supporting Iraqi government with weapons of mass destruction during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. Same chemical weapons that in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks became an excuse for American invasion of Iraq. Notwithstanding, when George Bush made his premature speech of mission accomplished aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln on May 1st, 2003, Bechtel and Halliburton were already in Iraqi soil, contracts in hand. Ethos of war and terror flattened and demonized all Muslims, regardless of language, cultural differences, or beliefs as terrorists. Xenophobia takes many different forms. When writing new programs for climate adaptation, perhaps acknowledge the extraterritoriality of the United States empire. Any New Deal requires first and foremost divestment from extra territories illegally occupied or controlled financially, economically, politically by the United States, from Guantanamo Bay to Diego Garcia Island, as a sign of acknowledgement that climate justice must absolutely include systemic change in the structures of white supremacy upheld by the imperial acquisitions of land and waters of majority brown people by coercion or expulsion. Call it a Brown New Deal. The contemporary global economy was built on the broken back of enslaved peoples, brown women and children on plantations that surround the equator line and landed in any hospitable climates, where both land and women were exoticized by the Western Orientalist gaze as open, ready, and fertile. The atrocities of plantations in many forms appear in many forms, namely the ETZs and FTZs in reproduction of what Naomi Klein has called in 1999 sacrifice zones. The building of the brown inferiority was fixed in denigration of cultural intelligence and our valuable traditions in heroic self-congratulatory image of American superiority. This is a mythical painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart in 1796, and all the elements here are symbols of American civilization and its relation to other nations. I'm almost done. The cultural signifiers of Persian and Arabs is pushed to the background, stepped on and thrown in the dustbin of the history. For instance, the carpet. Similarly, the exoticization of Persian gardens as a prehistory of modern American landscape architecture, or theorizing of the American West in the image of Arabian desert, are examples of how the contemporary publications and curricula incorporate brown landscapes selectively and strategically as a pedestal for American grandeur. Brown cultural intelligence, landscape praxis, and continued struggles are not subcategories of Western universal history, but an important chapter of a modern contemporary history and the manifestation of transgenerational resistance. So here I wonder if landscape can become a revolution in and of itself, through which brown bodies and identities are restored and brown cultural and political resurgence can bloom outside the tyranny of the state maps, between rivers, guided by matriarchal traces of lived territorial relations. And I wonder if brown landscapes represents a place where truth is unveiled, whether American landscape architects finally take off after centuries that got them blindfold. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ghazal, for a provocative and very engaging presentation. We will now continue our program with Khensani de Klerk's panel. Khensani de Klerk is an architectural designer and planner from Johannesburg. Her efforts are centered on gender empowerment in the architectural industry through research and practice. She is the founder and co-director of Matri Architecture, which is a collective that empowers African women as a network dedicated to African spatial education and development. And she's currently reading a Master of Philosophy in Architecture and Urban Design, RIBA 2, at the University of Cambridge, with her research focusing on safe space, infrastructure, and the social provision with aims to reduce gender-based violence in cities. Her work, currently based between South Africa and Switzerland, is located at the intersection of architecture, social science, and public policy. Khensani is also an editorial contributor to the Architectural Review in London. So join me in welcoming Khensani.
Thank you so much for this introduction and for the invitation to be involved in this incredible conference. So yes, I will begin by mentioning that I can only speak from where I come from. Those are the places and the people that make up my life thus far. And of course, the academic institution, academy, whatever you want to call it, plays a very significant role in that. And so my contribution today looks to navigating fieldwork, or the concept of fieldwork, across multiple geographies, both between the supposed global north and global south, but more particularly looking at how fieldwork as a method of mapping for development and education affects the uncovering of compacted landscapes. And so the methodology is something that I'm quite interested in. And responding to compacted grounds, we find ourselves as spatial practitioners tasked with not simply just intervening and creating, but revealing and unfolding those layers of history that have accumulated and compacted over time, particularly in an age, or the age, of decolonialism, if you like, finally entering academic discourse, and hopefully at some point accelerating transformation in practice. The task that I've identified amongst many other practitioners undoubtedly calls for a methodological focus on an ethics of care within the way in which we treat our treatment of context. And so to begin with context, you will notice that there will be quite a few images from South Africa in this presentation, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and a historical reference to both of those sites. And if we look at the definition of fieldwork, to be really rudimentary about it, according to the recognized dictionaries in Western canonical academia, so Oxford or Cambridge, it's really defined as the practical work conducted by a researcher in the natural environment rather than in the lab or the office. And so the really basic definition of this scientific specimen versus scientist's view, seen to be objective, establishes a hegemonic relationship between researcher and site, which contradicts contemporary intentions premised on participation across a binary that it conforms to, or at least it brings attention into the method from the get-go. And so what does it mean to define fieldwork as an approach to understanding context that prioritizes care and ethics? And we'll be unpacking that in this short presentation. And I suppose asking this question also begs us to revise the rhetorical question of how we could ever dare to design in spaces without getting to know them. And further, what the process of knowing or coming to know as far as we can means. And through this presentation, I would suggest that that is a process of uncovering. And as pointed out by many others in this conference over the last 2 days, the landscape, of course, is very much so a palimpsest of urban, ecological, social, economic, and digital aspects, intersecting in intangible and tangible ways. And I think very much so becoming more visible as something that's constantly in flux. And so a growingly obvious paradox is presented to the traditional canonical approach to permanence inscribed in the way in which we have to build or we have to form through our spatial practice. And so this is an image taken by David Goldblatt in 2002 in Johannesburg. You can see women getting their hair braided on the street, lots of things happening in the buzzing CBD. And I think it's quite interesting. You know, through my work, I can imagine also through the work of many others, we begin to resist the traditional approach of fieldwork in its observation by the researcher at traditionally his subjects, but rather seeing what lies within the everyday practices with what Yasmina Bibijan would speak about, and overlooked histories in rituals of everyday practice in relation to the land, but also in relation to the urban context, the urban landscape, and the communities concerned within that context. So these women are very much so the cartographers of everyday life, everyday practices by virtue of their occupation. And so this is a sort of contribution to the evolution of fieldwork practices in architecture, landscape architecture, spatial practice. And it doesn't necessarily clutch on the traditional ethnographic or anthropological schools of thought, despite respecting those schools of thought, but in ways appropriate to updating ethics and responding to the livelihoods of those previously termed subjects, which from this point in the presentation, I will only refer to as people and stakeholders and participants. As spatial practitioners, we have the capacity to uncover layers through our visual competencies, challenging us to, or rather challenging us with the choice and decision to make visible or to not make visible. And so the process of fieldwork and those strategies employed in fieldwork are inherently and inevitably a political and social act, irrespective of where practitioners decide to consciously place themselves in the field. Context has its rules, it has its pace, and here lies an opportunity to shine light on the act of listening as a source of inspiration for designing collectively. That listening, I would suggest, is fundamental to uncovering. And I will unpack very briefly some of my research work to share some aspects of this learning and unlearning process constantly in flux that I have encountered through focusing on strategies of alternative fieldwork that center those people concerned in the site, those participants. The project is called Public Agenda, born out of my MPhil research at the University of Cambridge, which sought to and continues to seek understanding how infrastructure perpetuates, affects, encourages, discourages, and ultimately really implicates those experiences that Black women and women of color in Cape Town have in relation to gender-based violence. The work employed a digital ethnographic approach, which invited survivors of gender-based violence in Cape Town to share their experiences, both positive and negative ideas, and to make these spatially legible in ways that communicated aspects of their stories often overlooked at public policy level. These culminated in the form of collages, which serve as vignettes and snapshots of history, whilst making those previously invisible layers of the city landscape visible and therefore less avoidable in implementation. At the same time, it acted as a conduit between the survivors of gender-based violence, giving them a sort of digital landscape to occupy in the process of sharing their stories. And in attempting to gather a multiplicity of experiences, whilst restricted geographically owing to the coronavirus pandemic, I developed this platform that could create this safe space online for sharing experiences, fantasies, and ideas, whilst gathering information that could inform, a collective understanding of safe space typologies for healing and empowerment, what Carl Kossegaard would refer to as alternative space, and what Nancy Fraser would speak about as well in her counterpublics. And so these are vignettes from the platform, which asked participants to respond to 8 different topics. Participants responded via individual WhatsApp conversations with me in whatever medium they felt worked best. And then I would upload these vignettes and attach a specific unique number to protect their identities. And there was a constant feedback loop, and participants would come back and comment on how the process was an open space for them to tell stories that they had not acknowledged as violent before in many instances, or had never spoken about with anyone else, but could recognize in the patchwork or quilt of experiences displayed through these specific questions and these specific responses in collage form. And so the process of uncovering layers can also be a process of care. Some topics presented ideas of safety and fantasy, showing how imagined spaces can possibly be realized through responsive intervention. As Legacy Russell Harlem-based author of glitch feminism would put it, using the internet to play and perform and explore still has exceptional potential for igniting a glitch that can reawaken systems that are stagnant today. And so giving ourselves this space to experiment perhaps brings us closer to a projection of, I don't like to use the word, but a sustainable future. And through visual articulation presents a provocation that takes this first step at manifesting accounts, revealing the compacted layers of the social environment. And so collage was used as a strategy to protect the identities of these participants, as well as to imagine future imaginaries as we have seen common in Afrofuturistic visuals and musical arts way before the 1970s, but of course looking to the obvious examples of Sun Ra to contemporary examples of Wakanda and Grace Jones, amongst many. And at the same time, this medium allowed each story to be read within a collection, painting a quilted understanding of the layers making up the compacted landscape, not necessarily putting these struggles and ideas in competition. Coalition is something we desperately need in South Africa with this issue. And so employing narrative analysis becomes important for duly recognizing the multiplicity of histories within a single landscape, accepting that memory and telling play a role in determining the characteristics of these social layers. What I have called this sort of retelling, you have termed it voiced data, as a means of uncovering context. And it draws from this discipline shining light on notions of time and memory that through stories reveal what has happened in the past, but at the same time, what has been relived in the present through telling the account. And so a creative exercise of thinking collectively comes through the fictionalization of imaginaries that people would like to see safety manifest into. And so this renders the landscape active rather than a passive mass, which as spatial practitioners, we would traditionally simply just build on. There is much to be said about dissemination too, of course. And so that informed the platform existing online, and that is sharing and making communicable collective findings in language that pays due respect to those concerned with the context, ultimately resisting and rejecting extractive processes of fieldwork, common in spatial practice today. Even as a Black woman myself, concerned with the subject, I put in inverted commas, of Black women, my single lens only perpetuates the traditional canonical idea of fieldwork. And so voiced data really looks at a multi-lensed approach. And so we ask the question, a little bit facetiously, who benefits from the typical researcher's findings? The researcher, of course, the researcher who receives the PhD and specializing in said culture and said context. It's a very audacious approach, which I think we are becoming more and more aware of. And so thinking about the pace and language of those concerned in the site purports not only to simply pay respect to the context, but also evolves traditional academic language to expand and serve a larger audience in its academic and educational ethos. Knowledge production, sharing, questioning, and critique, not exclusively limited to the canon. And so redefining fieldwork with a priority on scribing accessible spatial lexicons into the institution is a decolonial mechanism of benefit to institutions concerned with progress and transformation. At the same time, making room in education for quote unquote othered or overlooked knowledges to become visible and referenced when developing the built environment. And so I'm ending, this is the last bit, but given the expansion of knowledge exchange through the digital landscape, this is really an exciting moment for dissolving parameters of room. The landscape is expanding, and this sort of gives us potential for infinite accessibility when visualized in ways that consider the pace of context. Fieldwork is a mechanism for multiplicity, or it can be, stating positionality and adding richness to the sources that enablers, those with with money to recognize initiatives, refer to, and eliminating any excuses for no data being around, or no data being around for the in efforts of, or no data being around that typically keeps efforts of transformation static. And so fieldwork, when done strategically, creates credible reference, possibly manipulating the resources of enablers who frankly owe a great amount to those marginalized and oppressed groups experiencing any hardship due to their relationship to the contemporary and historical built environments. And so I will end on this slide by mentioning that, architects, landscape architects, spatial practitioners, city planners, the list goes on, if equipped with social skills that prioritize ethical procedures, have the ability to employ visual imagination as storytellers in bringing these stories and qualitative accounts of everyday life, sometimes seen as mundane, into a language understood outside of the siloed sectors and really in service to disciplines concerned with developments that are unable to fathom the extent of the issue and also the extent of the possibility. In this sense, uncovering the compacted layers is helpful for setting out sustainable agendas, knowing clearly what the implications might be, rethinking fieldwork to uncover compacted landscapes is an opportunity to use our visualizing as really a conduit for development and spatial education. And so I'll end on a provocation and a question, and that's, what does fieldwork mean to you in your practice and your research? And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Khensani, for that last provocation. I think it'll give our audience lots to think about as we move on to our next presentation by Ana María Durán, Calisto. Ana María is currently a lecturer at the Yale School of Architecture and has taught design studios and research seminars at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, Harvard, Columbia, University of Michigan, UC Temuco, and has been a teaching fellow at the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She curated the 15th Quito Architecture Bienal, Visible Cities, was a national curator for the 9th Bienal of the Ibero-Americana de Arquitectura y Urbanismo, BIAL, and an academic advisor for the UN Conference Habitat 3. She's currently a member of the Scientific Panel for the Amazon, SPA, convened by the SDSN and the UN. Ana María co-founded Estudio A0 with Jazz Calirai in Quito in 2002. Under the advice of Susanna Hecht, Ana María is writing a doctoral dissertation on the history of urbanization in the Amazon basin, with a specific focus on the oil urbanisms of Ecuador. Thank you so much. And please welcome with me, Ana María.
Thank you so much, Vanessa and Jihany, for having invited us today. And Ghazal and Khensani, it's been wonderful to listen to both of you. Fantastic presentations, very stimulating. We'll talk about them later. And I guess that mine is going to be a little bit different, even though I strongly share your concerns, but I'm much older. So with age, you do move into what Khensani called the extent of the possibilities. I think I'm in that stage right now. Back when we were putting the South America project together with Felipe Correa, who's at UVA, in the year that was back in 2000, the fieldwork was in 2007, 2008, but the actual network didn't coagulate until 2011. And it was all about, extraction, continental scale extraction, and the deep marks that it was leaving on the ground with the genocide, epistemicide, and ecocide that goes with extractivism in Latin America as much as we have seen it does in the Middle East. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm working a lot with the communes in Amazonia. And when I was invited to LABash, what came to my mind immediately, because I'm obviously always relating everything to Amazonia, is that I thought, okay, compacted grounds, I like the topic. I like the topic of the ground, which is obviously thick and full of nutrients, if you wish, but it did make me think a lot about soils. So it stimulated me to discuss the issue of soils in Amazonia, because they actually have played a very important role precisely in the development of these alternative histories and these alternative narratives, historic narratives, that may contribute to truth, as you said, in the landscape. Landscapes are landscapes of truth. I always say that architecture and the landscape and cities don't know how to lie. They really don't. Everything is embedded in the history of space. And you will see the role that soils specifically have played in the history of Amazonian archaeology, specifically modern archaeology. So I decided to call this lecture Cultural Soils of Amazonia. And talking about that whole history of knowledge, of the epistemologies that we've inherited and that we use, that are highly Eurocentric. And, it doesn't matter where we come from, we are framed, we are in a way colonized, if you wish, through education, into thinking about knowledge in very specific ways and through very specific historical lenses. And in the case of the archaeology of Amazonia, it is interesting that in the 50s, more or less, this famous archaeologist, Betty Meggers, with her husband, Clifford Evans, traveled throughout South America. They did fieldwork in very many places in Amazonia. But as you can imagine, in Amazonia, which is such a liquid, dynamic landscape, it is very difficult to do fieldwork in traditional archaeological terms. The methodologies of stratification are difficult to pursue because the soils move so much and the strata turn over, and it's difficult to map the time history of these places. But there were local archaeologists working all over the place, and Meggers and Evans, joined them in different countries like Brazil and Ecuador to study, for example, the ceramics that were popping up all over the place. Ceramics from the Amazon are the oldest ceramics in the Americas, by the way. And they wrote, specifically Betty wrote this book, which is very famous, Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise. And in a nutshell, the premise that Meggers postulates in this book is known as ecological or environmental determinism, but basically it says that in an area of the world where soils are so poor in nutrients and highly acidic, the possibility of having had intensive agriculture and the possibility of, therefore, according to the history, the Neolithic theory and the theory of the urban revolution of Childs, an Australian archaeologist, the possibility of having had cities in Amazonia was nil. Basically, environmental determinism doomed Amazonia in terms of having ever been an urban place or a place for civilization. And embedded in the environmental determinism theory was obviously a racial determinism theory as well. How could these, peoples have produced, constructed, designed, or even maybe imagined cities? Impossible. And this hypothesis of the soils, which is based on the soils, and that's what I want to make sure that, I bring up today to the table, is the hypothesis that stagnated Amazonian archaeology for a very long time. And of course, this has a history in the Enlightenment. We know that even before, at the end of the 18th century and in the 18th century and through the 19th century, lots of naturalists, mainly from Europe, then when the US became an important player at a global scale, also from the US, but very many naturalists came to South America and constructed a narrative that became the foundation for Betty Meggers, in a way. Amazonia was a land of hypernaturalism. It was a land in which human beings had no effect. They were not cultural landscapes. They were just humans that had adapted to nature and lived in harmony with nature, but had nothing to do with its actual construction. And this obviously is, at the core. And this is Wallace, British naturalist as well. And just to, a little divergency here. This I know is being questioned right now through decolonial theory. And for example, Fabiano Cueva, a contemporary artist in Ecuador, does this amazing work at precisely bringing to the fore and vindicating the native knowledge, quote unquote native. The indigenous is also a complicated word, but the knowledge of the original nations of the Americas that is embedded in the thought of Humboldt, of La Condamine, of Wallace, of every single one of these naturalists that roamed through South America. And with immense humor, he's reminding us, don't forget the source. And he has this beautiful project that I recommend you follow called Archivo Humboldt, the Humboldt Archive, where he's precisely making it clear that the sources of these naturalists were indigenous sources in the territory. And the phrase that he has, I think, is very interesting. Mi primer viaje lo hice solo, con un indio. My first voyage, I did it by myself. Oh, with an Indian. It's like, again, this vision that the natives were just one more element of the landscape, not fully human. One more organism in the ecosystem, if you wish, as if we weren't, this separation from nature that is typical of modern Western thought. But in this genealogy, in this family of knowledge of Amazonian archaeology, there was a very interesting guy. Betty Meggers and Clifford Evans were writing in the 50s and 60s. And of course, here I have Padre Porras, because specifically in Ecuador, where Betty was doing work as well, Padre Porras was her local source. In the 70s, Donald Lathrop comes up with a theory that sort of broke completely with the linear narrative that the anomalies of Amazonia in terms of, for example, incredibly complex ceramics could be explained simply by diffusion, by saying, oh, some of the civilized peoples from the Andes must have come down to the lowlands and settled in different places. And Donald Lathrop, who did a lot of ethnoarchaeology in the 70s, said, no, I think it was the other way around. Amazonians went up the Andes and took certain patterns that were like seeds of civilization to the mountains. And everybody thought he was crazy. But archaeology is actually proving him right. And in terms of the anomalies, just to use the Kuhnian idea of scientific paradigms, and how once there's a consensus and an established paradigm, it's very difficult to break through unless something like a muon, like it's happening right now in physics, a muon emerges, an anomaly, an ad hoc element that cannot be explained by the paradigm. And the environmental determinism theory that doomed urbanization in Amazonia basically started facing too many anomalies. One, ceramics. Ceramics were everywhere in Amazonia, and they were incredibly complex, not characteristic of, simple nomadic societies, but of much more organized and probably urban societies. Also, the rock art everywhere. There are more or less 10,000 archaeological sites in Amazonia that we know today. I know that more will be added to the list, but we're talking about 10,000 sites, and many of them are sites like this one. And lots of geoglyphs popping up everywhere. Unfortunately, through deforestation, we learned about them, but these geometric patterns on the ground, which are obviously human-made, started emerging everywhere as well, in Bolivia and Amazonia, in Acre, in Brazil, all over the place. So these anomalies start accruing, and the immense regional scale, landscape formations, geoformations, terraformings, incredible shifts of soils and lands in Amazonia that again could not be explained through simple societies of small pockets of nomadic peoples moving around and collecting and hunting. And the forest itself, the complexity of the forest with these acid and poor soils, how do we explain the fact that we have such an abundant and rich forest above? And the theory that, the jungle in a way is cannibalistic, it eats itself. It's made of cycles. It's on the surface, but continuously eating what it sheds, the biomass, reabsorbing its own biomass. But in the 80s, another huge transformation happened. And this is where I feel, this is the one Anna Curtenius Roosevelt, the one woman that figures out that Amazonia was indeed urban. And what helped her, develop the evidence that would make it irrefutable? Satellite technologies. So she went to Brazil to do archaeological work there. And of course, what was happening in Brazil in the 80s, that there was a lot of satellite surveying for resources, natural resources, for land grabbing and extraction, of course. And the same technologies that were being used to subjugate this ginormous territory was also used to map its archaeology. And Anna wrote this book, Mound Builders of the Amazon. And basically what she argued is that Amazonia was highly populated and that it had very large and complex societies that could be described as urban within the criteria, within a different ontology of the urban, but within the, the criteria or most of the criteria that was applied, say, in Mesopotamia or other areas of the world by archaeologists. And she focused on this notion of the huge landscape transformation that Amazonians had performed in order to make Amazonia precisely capable of sustaining very large populations. These populations died because of the pathogens that penetrated the Americas in the 16th century, starting with the expedition of Orellana in 1532. We had viruela, we had like all sorts of smallpox, influenza, yellow fever, malaria, and many other pathogens penetrating Amazonia. So imagine if right now that we're facing COVID, we are suffering in the way we're suffering. Imagine the Americas in the 16th century, it was not just one pathogen that penetrated the territory, but more than a dozen of them. So that depopulated the region, which was later on renaturalized. But it is Anna Curtenius Roosevelt who, establishes the theory of an urban pre-Columbian Amazonia. And the evidence since the 80s has simply been piling up. I mean, I can't bore you with the amount of scientific papers and books that are being published every month, every year on the topic. I mean, I have a hard time following up, but the evidence is huge. With LiDAR, we're discovering large networks of land transformations linked by roads, by canals. Heckenberger is doing an incredible work in the Singu, unveiling also I call them these agroecological urban constellations of Amazonia, because they're not cities in the Mesopotamian sense. They're not cities in the Greco-Roman sense. These are very interesting urbanisms in which agroecological, because the word, agroecology is important. This is not agriculture in terms of a monocrop. This is agriculture in terms of a polyculture. So these agroecological urbanisms that are completely fused with waterborne transportation systems, also roads, canals, and a constellation of settlements, of communes, of family, ethnic groups that are in association with each other, sometimes in war with each other, but that make up these large constellations of 200, 250,000, sometimes more people, just like in the Maya realm further up north in Mesoamerica. So, the examples, Beni Bolivia is another area that is highly studied, where again, we see these constellations that are interlinked. And LiDAR, even in my own country, this is in Ecuador, is allowing us to precisely uncover, we're looking for gold, we're looking for copper, for oil, for all sorts of resources. And what do we get? The whispers of our ancestors coming to talk to us. to let us know that there's a different way of living in the world. And it is a decentralized, polycentric way where the redistribution of resources is incredibly fair. You can read that in the land. And where the relationship between culture and nature is incredibly symbiotic and positive. Human beings have come to be perceived as a negative force, a force of destruction. All we can do is damage the planet. Not true, not true. We can be exactly the opposite. We can be designers and builders of habitat, which is what Amazonians were. I'm not saying we should go back to, imitating that literally. The spiral of time is irreversible. But I do think that the deep past of the Americas contains keys, especially today, and that we really need to look at them in detail beyond these prejudices that have kept the knowledge of these cultures stagnant for so long. And of course, now you have lots of archaeologists who are working here, just to name 5, Heckenberger, Clark Erickson, Denis Chan, he's in France. I can't pronounce French names, I'm sorry. Stephen Rostand and Eduardo Neves in Brazil, and many, many, many more whom I cannot mention right now. But the key and terra morena in Portuguese, la terra preta do Indio, is a very fertile type of earth that is found everywhere in Amazonia. Because we know that in the Várzeas, in the flooding areas, the soils are fertile because there are lots of nutrients coming down from the Andes, from the Guineas, and also from the south, especially from the Andes, that are renovating these soils and that are allowing them to be fertile and to sustain large and complex populations. But besides those soils that are evident in the interfluvial areas, including, this has been mapped and you can find the maps online, we know that these anthropogenic soils, these terra pretas, are the ones that explain the huge amount of settlements, constellations, urban networks that populated Amazonia in the 16th century and before that. Some argue, that there are about 2,000 years of urban history in Amazonia. But these are the terra pretas you can see here. Where you don't have them, this is a very dark, fertile humus. And next to it, on the left, you can see the typical acidic soils of the region. And what you see here is a culture that has created the possibility for intense polyculture in the Amazon. And it is that intense polyculture in the Amazon that was able to sustain large, complex societies and populations that were described by the Spanish chroniclers who first went down these tributaries and the Amazon in the 16th century. So I was telling you about Carvajal. Fascinating to read him. He describes immense cities in the quote unquote jungle, and very sophisticated and very developed. This is 16th century, 17th century. Teixeira still describes them. By the time Humboldt, by the time even before that, by the time La Condamine comes, cities are not described anymore, but just small pockets of settlements, nomadic tribes that are hunting and gathering, and the whole story of Amazonia changes, and it becomes like the anti-urban space. But my advisor at UCLA, Susana Hecht, spent lots of times with the Kayapó, lots of time with the Kayapó in Brazil. And she, for example, started describing how the Kayapó smoke the soils, because there's a beautiful relationship. Talk about our positive relationship with nature now that Amazonia is being burned down to the ground by fire. Fire has been key to the development of this lush, bountiful forest, but in the way that Amazonians use it. As Susana calls it, blue fire. It's like Amazonians smoke the biomass. And this smoking of the biomass, they smoke everything, I'll show you, allows them to harness the nutrients into the soil and allows them to produce these anthropogenic soils, which are not just migrants of biomaterial piling up in the settlements throughout thousands of years. They also very purposefully create biochars. That's Susana with an anthropologist, a good friend of hers, whose name I completely forget. Poissy, I think is the last name, who spent time with the Kayapó describing these processes, and those are the Kayapó. So again, all these techniques and the use of fire is described for very many activities in Amazonia. For example, to build the famous dugout canoes, how you use fire in a contained way, in a managed way, to be able precisely to create these incredible canoes that slide beautifully in the water, and fire becomes almost, what trims them, what makes them perfect. Fire is used also to smoke the houses in architecture. So once the roof is built, and in Amazonia, the architecture is mainly a huge roof. In most communities, the roof is the predominant feature. And the fire is always within, under the roof, and it smokes the roof, and that helps in very many ways to consolidate the roof, to prevent insects from penetrating, and so on and so forth. I won't get into the details. But if I have time, I'll share a video. What time is it? It's been already 23 minutes. I think I should wrap up. So I'll just go through these very fast, just to show you how they build these roofs, which eventually, and let's pull them further up, talk about fieldwork. This was a studio. Can you, I think I...
Yeah, perfect.
This was a design-build studio in Amazonia. And of course, we spend lots of time in the site, helping with the construction, understanding these techniques so that we can contribute to revive them. Not just to, steal the techniques, because we don't want to do that, but on the other hand, to value them and promote them among policy members who want us to deal with concrete in Amazonia, so that we can be modern and convince them that there are other ways of doing things. Where's the next slide? But then I ended up spending lots of time in the kitchen, not just in the construction site. I was fascinated by the maito and the way women make the maito with the big plantain leaves that we would pick up in the chacra early in the morning, everything super fresh. We would go get the fish. They do have fish ponds now, and that's actually tilapia, which is not an Amazonian fish. And of course, the palmito. And I'll show you afterwards. I want to show you how they fold them. It's so beautiful. I'm manipulating this. There. And they're making the maito for the group. And then how they fold them. Of course, this is like the realm of the organic. It's incredible. Traditionally, there was no trash in Amazonia. Everything penetrates the cycle of life and death. Now there's trash, of course, there are plastics all over the place. But traditionally, there wasn't. And the next one I want to show you, because this is what made me understand the soils as well, is that everything in Amazonia has this logic of smoking. So you smoke your food, you smoke your house, you smoke the biomass to produce biochars. There's this incredibly positive relationship with fire. And in terms of like contemporary urbanisms, which is what I am concerned with right now, the first woman, again, notice the presence of women in Amazonian research. Berta Becker is a geography who was the first one in the 60s and 70s in Brazil to start describing the huge favelization of Amazonia. And another famous book is Rainforest Cities by Browder and Godfrey, who sort of like, took her torch and also started investigating the phenomenon of modern urbanization in the region and the havoc that is reaping all over the place. And you may ask, you may ask, but well, my God, Ana Maria, all those people, they're all, where are the Amazonians? the Amazonians are nowhere in this story. I just wanted to say that there is research emerging from Amazonians, and it's amazing, and I'm reading it, and I hope that this will shift the voices to those who should be discussing these more than anyone else. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you so much, Ana Maria. That was a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Ghazal and Khensani. You have really laid the ground for what can be an amazing discussion.